Good evening and welcome to Solutionary TV. I am your host, Dr. Tatiana, and tonight is going to be a bit of fun. Many of us are romantic and equally perplexed about what is going on with our current economy, what is going on with growth in various industries, and there has been a great deal of focus around sustainability and beyond sustainability because we don't just want to sustain our current systems or our current lifestyle. We really want to adopt a regenerative model. So the romance around sustainability and regenerative models has really been focused on community, reconnecting with one another, and being able to downsize into smaller homes, tiny homes, working with local gardens and farms. And so tonight it is my pleasure to be able to welcome an expert in all of these and many more aspects of this growing and romanticized industry and field, Harvey Harman. Let me tell you a little bit about Harvey and we'll introduce him and welcome him to the show. Harvey is an organic farmer, green builder, community organizer, and conservation-based land developer. He's a co-founder of the Sustainable Farming Program at Central Carolina Community College in Pittsboro, and has also helped to start a green building program at Central Carolina while teaching classes in sustainable agriculture, green building, and permaculture at CCCC for the past 21 years. Presently, Harvey works as a construction director for the Chatham Habitat for Humanity, focused on building energy-efficient, sustainable, affordable housing and advocating for more affordable housing and more sustainable development. Harvey also is the co-founder of Living Well Community, a sustainable, conservation-oriented green community on the Deep River in Randolph County, North Carolina. In his spare time, Harvey loves to build and design small and tiny houses and enjoys hearing and telling stories of courage, humor, and resilience. Welcome, Harvey. It is a pleasure to have you today.
Great. Thank you to be here.
Yes, exactly. I want to let everyone here know I've been out and seen your Living Well community. It's got so much potential. It has a real organic flow to the layout of not only the lots, but also what can be placed on the lots, the different style and size of homes from, kind of a standard home of over maybe 2,000 square feet down to patio homes and tiny homes. I want you to tell maybe our audience tonight, what got you so passionate about creating your own community? Let's start there.
Well, I have always loved connecting with land. So I grew up on a wonderful, beautiful piece of land in central Pennsylvania. It was a farm that backed up to state game land, and so we had access to forest and fields and streams and wildlife and farm animals. And over the time since then, I've spent a lot of time on different pieces of land in different parts of the world even, and always felt strong connection to pieces of land everywhere I went. And so my real passion, I would say, is connecting with land, figuring out what to do with land, how to work with land, and how to live harmoniously with land.
Mm-hmm.
So when my wife and I, after college, did volunteer work different places, and we spent 5 years in Southern Africa doing volunteer work. And when we came back from that, we moved to a small farm in Chatham County, central North Carolina, and started farming there. My wife went back to school to be a midwife, and I started an organic farm. We did that together, and I got, even more excited about land and what's possible with land. And so eventually started doing other land projects besides farming. Some of them had residential components, and I just wasn't finding builders that wanted to build or could build the way I was interested in. Green, energy efficient, looking at alternative building systems and strategies, trying to use less energy, trying to be more efficient with space. So I started building the houses myself because I couldn't locate the builder I was looking for.
Hmm.
And that continued to develop, and I started doing more land projects and figuring out other ways to kind of push this envelope a little about what it means to create and live and be in a sustainable community. So that's what got us to Living Well Community, which is the project we're working on now, and we'll talk about that more later.
Mm-hmm. So there really is an evolution, like many things that any expert in an innovative field very often shares, is that it took a degree of vision on their part, and very often finding that the architecture or the path to creating this for themselves did not already exist. We have to be very much in a place that is entrepreneurial in spirit and see what isn't there and figure out whether or not we can draw the best resources and the brilliance and contribution of others to bring something into form that's never been here before. So I really commend you, because I realize that that scope of a neighborhood with that much variability in it for accommodating community and family and networking with farms and gardens. And I know you have, it's a beautiful piece of property, but you've got two rivers that converge. There is a lot of opportunity for social events and really making it an epicenter in that particular area of North Carolina. So just taking on a scope this big, maybe we can take a couple steps back and talk about something that you brought up really early in the beginning of the discussion, which is connecting with the land. I think that land was tremendously special. I had the pleasure of being able to walk that land and really get a feel for its frequency and some of the spirit around what has taken place there before. But perhaps you can share with our viewers, how do you go about vetting a piece of property, and what was it that made you narrow in on that particular piece of property for this community?
So one thing that's happened over time, I think traditional cultures are much more aware of the energies that are present on land. Those energies can be from a lot of different sources. It can be veins of rock or water. They can be different energy lines that crisscross around the world. They can be energy from past things that happened on that land, to name a few. But anyway, all land has energy, and if we pay attention, we can start to sense that. It's, I believe, an ability we all have, but because we don't need to have that deep integration with the place we live for our sustenance in the way that we used to, I think most of us are just not aware that that even exists. So the other thing is we've disturbed the land so much that that's also changed the energy as well. But in any case, if you go to land that's less disturbed, many people might have this experience by going to, say, a national park or a more of a wilderness area. You start to get a sense that the land, you have a feeling, let's say, maybe you have a feeling. Certain places feel just more enjoyable, or you have an emotion maybe, or a feeling. When you're in certain places, you can even tell, like you might be taking a walk on a trail, and you might be able to tell that, at this particular place, maybe I just feel really a calmness, or this place really, for some reason, I really like this place. And sometimes you can identify what that is. I mean, sometimes it's, you're taken by a wonderful vista or a large boulder or a stream, but sometimes it's there isn't if you pay attention close enough, there isn't always a visible indication of what's projecting that feeling, how you're picking up, what's causing you to have that particular perception. For me, a lot of times I have to get really quiet. Like if there's too much chatter going on, if I'm thinking too much about something else, or have too much going on, I don't even I don't pick up on those things.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
so I can just share my experience. I don't think I'm particularly gifted more than anyone else. It's just that over time I've started to learn to be a little more aware, and that's been a kind of transformative realization, that the land is also speaking to us and communicating with us, and vice versa. And
Mm-hmm.
so we can actually have maybe you'd call it a conversation back and forth. And so that's a very different relationship you start to have with a piece of land. And it maybe gets at a sense of what many of us had, in that we had a sense of place, like where was home? I mean, where do we feel at home? And I don't mean just like a house, but where do we really feel like embraced in more than just a human sense? Embraced in like fully understood and honored as part of a living environment.
Mm-hmm. You're really talking, aren't you, Harvey, about a symbiosis then between ourselves and the land and all sentient life that's on it, being a really important premise before deciding where we are going to place our bodies and our home and our children and our families, and even attract others of a similar vein in terms of what their goals and their aspirations and their values may be, which kind of brings it back then to community. And we can even ask right now, why do you think at this point we don't have a larger drive in our current economy and within our current society towards communities developing all over the place? I mean, there has been growth and there continues to be growth, but in terms of mainstream and the way that we think as a society and the way that we have a tendency to be somewhat isolated from one another in our neighborhoods and in our cul-de-sacs, what would you say is the biggest reason why we have a tendency to not have as many of these types of intentional communities as thoroughly felt into as you've just described?
Well, I can give some thoughts. I don't know the full answer to that question, but I can tell a couple stories that maybe give a little reflection on that. So, I mean, the first is we don't have more community because we don't need it, and that is that. What I mean when I say that is that, when does community happen the most, for people? Well, sometimes when there's like a natural disaster, people are amazed at how, people they didn't know help them.
Mm-hmm.
Neighbors share resources. And so it's sort of the blessing that comes out of the disaster is that people are forced to rely on each other in a way they weren't before. And the blessing is that they realize, wow, that was really, a wonderful thing that happened for us. And why did it take a disaster to bring it out?
Right.
And why don't we sustain it after the disaster in the same way?
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is, when I say we don't need it, we don't, we've developed a culture that's very independent. We don't do a lot of things together with other people. So we've sort of really moved away from community, and we don't really know well how to do that again. Mm-hmm. So that's one story. And I mean, another kind of story that might reflect on that a little bit. I know when you live in another culture where they have more of a sense of commitment to each other, in part because they depend on that for survival much more than we do. So we lived in, you see it still present. So that's true in many developing countries, for example. It's not perfect. I mean, no I don't want to romanticize it, but you know, unfortunately, wealth almost breeds. The more wealth you have, it almost destroys community. So, in many places where wealth is lower, people actually tend to depend more on each other, and community also is more powerful and present. So
Interesting. It sounds maybe like it's the misdistribution of wealth, as opposed to communities that are still and have for literally, hundreds, if not thousands of years, kind of maintained a sense of we are stronger together. I know that many of us that travel the world will see, like you said, in third world countries, where there are plots of land that everyone is gardening on, or they're growing their animals on, or they're doing a lot of barter and trade. Even walking across northern Spain, when I walked with a colleague of mine on the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, which is a thousand-year-old pilgrimage that many take, thousands, tens of thousands take every year. Just walking through Spain, there was such a collective of neighborhoods that rolled one into another, farms, one into the other. And when you'd get into some of the larger towns, everyone would be kind of coming out after a long day's work. I did walk during the summer, and the elderly were out dressed to the nines, and the children were out, and people had brought in all this fresh food. And so I do recognize that there are many aspects of our culture that have moved away from this and become, a bit more isolationistic, and that it is a hunger, I think, and a romanticism, as I've already stated, that we are moving back into, maybe sustainably sized homes, with recent literature on the not so big life, not so big home, giving full credit to these amazing authors that have, author, I believe it's Sarah Suzanka that wrote that. It changed a lot of the thinking in our economy and in our current society, particularly here in the United States. And so, when we think about tiny homes, I see people's eyes light up. I very often will see someone that I would never have expected that thinks that that's a really exciting idea, get tickled about it. So tell us where you're finding in terms of the communities that you support and the classes that you teach, and even the concept around diminishing all of this extra weight of responsibility residentially, that tiny homes and some of the implementations around tiny homes have attracted a lot of interested students in your particular area of expertise.
So tiny homes typically are homes that are under 200 square feet in size. There's no single definition, but that's one that's often used. Or they're often houses that are small enough that they could be built on a trailer, so an 8 by 24 trailer or 8 by 30 trailer, something like that. And when we talk about small houses, we typically talk about houses that are under 1,200 square feet, although the goal for us in any promotion we do of small and tiny houses is not so much like there's a magic number. Like, it's not necessarily that the smallest house possible is the best house. It's more, how can we provide opportunity and ideas and resources that someone who maybe would have felt that they needed a 1,500 square foot house could adequately be satisfied in a 1,200 square foot house, or someone who thought 1,200 was really what they needed could figure out a way that 800 would work. And the reason for that is multiple. It takes a lot of resources to build a house. So the average house we're building now, new house, it's gone up dramatically. So in the 1960, the average house was just over 1,000 square feet. Now it's I read different numbers, but approximately 2,500 to 2,600 square feet. That's a big difference. So are we, what has changed in 60 years to make us feel like we need twice the house or 2.5 times the house? Well, I'm just going to leave that as a question for all of us to answer. But what I want to get back to is, obviously, we, even in our own culture, we have a history of living adequately in smaller houses. So part of it is just embracing our historical context too.
Mm-hmm.
But for a lot of people who really get excited about small and tiny houses, there's several common things that really motivate them. And it can be different for different people. And these aren't the only motivations, but I'll put them out there so you can hear what they are and see which of them resonate with you. So for some people, especially after the Great Recession, in 2008 and beyond, people just felt a lot more vulnerable economically. And so even if they had a job that had enough income that they could buy a house with a big mortgage or a bigger mortgage, they just said, I really don't want that obligation, that risk, that being tied to a 30-year mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
I choose not to take that amount of debt. So a certain number of people are motivated by that because it can feel one way to have a 30-year mortgage and a $1,000 or $1,500 a month payment when you think, oh, I'll always have a job that can support that. But a lot of people realize after 2008, that's not a guarantee, and the economy does feel more vulnerable, and I feel more vulnerable, so I want to adjust. Another motivation is, for some people, they just can't afford, $1,000 a month payment or a $600 a month payment. So they're saying, like, one of our motivations at Chatham Habitat for Humanity, we've been doing some work with small houses, is how can we get a house that's more like a car payment, like $250 a month or $200
That sounds
a
great.
month?
Yeah.
Because that really gets at part of the population that's much more vulnerable. So that's seniors on fixed incomes, people on disability, people who have, are working part-time jobs with no benefits, etc. Students. So how do you find housing options that a wider segment of the population can access?
Are those also, forgive me for interrupting, trailer built tiny homes? Are you talking about mobile tiny homes also when you're targeting this particular segment?
Well, with the work I do with Chatham Habitat for Humanity, we don't do, these are all houses that are built on a permanent foundation. So amazingly, you can build a fairly small house and still have it meet all the North Carolina building code requirements. So we've designed one that's 16 by 16, for example. That's 256 square feet. That's small by almost everyone's standards. So it's like a, one-room efficiency apartment, which many people have experience with as well. So basically it's one big room that's a combination kitchen, living, bedroom, and you have to, by the building code, have to have a separate bathroom with a toilet, sink, and shower. But you can fit all of that and meet all the requirements for the building code in something that's pretty small. Now, there can be other zoning requirements, like Raleigh, I believe the minimum size is 400 square feet. I have to double check that. Many towns don't have a minimum requirement, but some do. And then the other challenge is if you live somewhere with an HOA or covenants, they often have a minimum size.
Right.
Which is usually based on neighbors' concerns that someone builds a smaller house, it'll make their house that's bigger worth less, which isn't the traditional pattern either. The traditional neighborhood pattern in the United States is that you could have a neighborhood with quite a diversity of sizes, quite a diversity of styles, and those are the neighborhoods we want to take walks through because they're interesting.
That's right.
They're fun. They feel like a unique place. It's not so fun to go to a neighborhood where all the houses look the same and are approximately the same size and have the same facade.
Right.
So, but that's what we've created many, many times. So,
yes, I can hear the back intro to Weeds of they're all ticky-tacky and they all look just the same. Like some of our viewers will probably find some humor in that. But that's exactly what is a huge aspect of this community at Living Well, isn't it, Harvey? When you come in, there is not only different lot sizes, which has become a lot more common in some of the bigger developments, particularly here in North Carolina, but it allows for those that have different sizing needs and different ways they want to use their land. In addition to, having more of a community feel, so that we're going to bring in smaller families that are going to be just starting out, or we're going to have some of the elderly that are at the end of, a career or having retired. And it really allows there to be a much more diversified community in these types of really well thought out community types of environments, like the one at Living Well. Have you noticed that that has been a big draw for those that have come to your community, is that they really want the diversification of people at different age groups and looking to come together and actually share their lives in more of a community and societal based format?
I don't know if it's that clearly thought by everybody, but I will say that what people seem to have really enjoy both about what's unfolding and how it will continue to unfold is that, every house is different, that there's not a stigma about having either a big house or a little house. Again, it's not about one is better. It's about being thoughtful. What is the size that works for you, and how do you think through that choice? And the community isn't a judgment. It's not. So if someone builds a 2,000 square foot house and that's their choice and that's the decision they've come to, that's fine. But it's equally fine to build a 600 square foot house. Mm-hmm. And that's usually not the case. Usually, if you're part of a community and there's a 2,000 square foot house, you're not encouraged to think about building something that's, half that size or less. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the part that's enjoyable for people, is that they're not tied. The community isn't judgmental about size one way or the other, and people have a lot of choices one way or the other. So it does give more opportunity for that diversity. And what's evolving is that every house is different and they're fun to look at,
A lot of creativity there. And do you find that the goal in your community and those that you support in your teaching and in your advocacy are also focused on the aspect of self-reliance? And when I say self, I don't mean more of the isolationist, type of societal environment we have now in our neighborhoods, but more of a neighborhood, a collective and a collaborative self-reliance.
Well, I'd say that's a high priority of mine, and it's shared. It varies how, different people have different priorities. So at Living Well, we have 4 core values. So encourage diversity, but as long as these 4 core values are shared, that we're all in agreement about those. Then after that, there isn't, an expectation that you have to just be this or that. So the 4 core values are sustainability, the first one. Second one is health and wellness is a priority. The third one is honoring the sacred. And the fourth one is service to the greater good. Mm. Now, even with that, it's not like everybody has exactly, it's not dogmatic either. Like honoring the sacred is a pretty wide topic, and it isn't like assumed exactly how that has to look just one way. But what we do want is that, like, that's something we all can affirm, and it's okay to say a prayer, mm-hmm. meditate together, mm-hmm. start a meeting with some spiritual reading, whatever, so that notice the sacredness of certain areas on the property,
right,
etc. Let me show a little example of Living Well community. So,
please do. Yeah, hold that up high so that our audience can see.
Um, we're it's a concept map for the community. We're developing the first part of it, which is here along the main road, and that road was already in place before we bought the property in 2007. So some of how the development is happening was already predetermined because that was such a big infrastructure piece already there. But what I want to point out, what's sort of when I look at a piece of land, so there are a lot of things, like this is sort of unique in that, I mean, not every piece of land has these kind of unique features, but every piece of land will have some uniqueness to it. And so uncovering that is always like a great exploration. So when we bought this land originally, part of it had been logged, part of it had been a development that had been started and then not finished, so like things were overgrown, and it's been sort of like a slow. I sometimes think what I'm doing here is slowly allowing this land to be seen, and I don't always feel super wise in that. Sometimes I'm sometimes a slow learner, so sometimes it takes a long time for me to even get a good idea how to do that. And of course, I'm not the only one doing that now. There are other people there who are helping that process happen too. But that's part of what I sort of look at this partnership we're having with this piece of land is how do we take a piece of land, live on it well, but also allow the land to be seen, and what does that look like? And some pieces of land, like they sort of communicate like, I'm not ready to be seen yet, like like
Right.
let me just be like this for a while, and then we'll get back to you.
Gotcha.
But this property has a mile of frontage on a river and a major tributary creek on the other side, so a lot of water, which is also a very, we have all of us have, well, most of us have a really deep affinity to connect with water. And so that's another, there's sound of water over rocks. It's a very calming sound. It's kind of like some people find being at the ocean very calming, like the waves, like a repetitive sound that involves water.
Right. It's a healing and a therapeutic type of environment to be induced into, isn't it, Harvey?
Yes.
It sounds like there's so much focus, particularly with the Living Well community, that there be a very healthy symbiosis and a healing of the human and earth relationship. I've heard that term used before in another local sustainable community that does a lot of teaching and advocacy, and I just thought that was beautiful, the healing of the human earth relationship, because so often we overly commodify this home of ours, this earth field, and we see all of its resources as assets for ourselves rather than sentient life that we are sharing in this symbiosis. And to your point, it is important to have an environment that feeds us, that is nurturing to come home to, whether we go to a job and then come back, or we actually work on our land and we figured out how to turn it into something that can also support our livelihood or support our immediate community. So given all that's involved in attracting people that have a similar kind of mental moral credo about their home and the land and the respectfulness of sentient life and of their neighbors, and the kind of reciprocity that is necessary to build a successful community, being a good community organizer, a good communicator is also tremendously important. And we know that we have many out there, and I'm assuming with our listenership, our viewership tonight, those that are saying, now, how do I get started? Where do I get going? What would you say to them about bringing some of those core values together before you even necessarily move forward on a piece of land, Harvey?
Well, communities can happen two different ways, more than two, but primarily two different ways. One can be that either an individual or a small core group of people buy land or have land and open it up to other people. Or that can be like family land, or it can be land somebody owns, or it can be land that gets bought. I mean, the other way is a group of people can come together, kind of form a common vision, and then look for a piece of land that they think will match that. Both of those have, strengths, and both those have challenges. There's not one perfect way to do it. I would say a previous question you ask is, like, why aren't there more communities? And the reason is because it's harder than it seems like it should be.
Okay.
And
tell us about that.
Well, it's hard. So one of the things is, if we just take the land piece, it's hard to find a piece of land that fits well to a communal or community setting. Sometimes it can be zoning issues. Like, we're very fortunate. We're very fortunate living well. The town, we're in a small town, but it has very progressive and flexible zoning. So it allows us to, for example, cluster houses. So we can minimize, put them closer together to reduce costs for infrastructure, and also minimize how much land we have to disturb, and provide, that community closeness, and then leave more of the land undeveloped. So it's hard to find that kind of, flexibility. Land is also expensive. Some people will say to me, so we're in Randolph County, Living Well community, which is about an hour and 15 minutes, maybe an hour and 20 minutes west of Raleigh. But a lot of times people say, gee, because we have a river and a creek and like high bluff overlooking the creek and rock outcroppings and, really beautiful place. Sometimes people say, man, if you were just like 30 minutes closer to Chapel Hill, or, I was like, yeah. And then nobody could afford this piece of land if we were 30 minutes closer to.
The land demand is a big issue, isn't it, Harvey?
And so there's the zoning, and then the cost. So,
right.
And then finding the people, if you go that route, finding enough people all at the same time with the same interest that can together buy a piece of land is the challenge of doing it that way. And getting the approvals. It can take years to get the approvals. I mean, you can buy the piece of land, but then if you have to get all the approvals, meanwhile you have people who are interested in being part of a community, but they maybe can't wait 5 years,
sure,
put their life on hold to get all the approvals and then do the infrastructure. And
so, Harvey, let me ask you this: as someone who has so much wisdom about really the task at hand of looking at the full scope of finding the land, vetting the land, making certain, as you said, that the land wants to be developed, that it's going to be harmonious to the intended plans, getting like-minded individuals together, and then even setting up a type of understanding or governance. Most communities have HOAs or covenants. There's going to be some sort of governance, maybe a little bit more loosely formatted for this type of community. And then the goals, of, are we going to be growing community gardens? Are we going to have group events? If we have the dwindling generation of farmers that we have been told again and again in the mainstream media that are getting close to retirement, and they don't have successive generations, either children or grandchildren, that are interested in taking on these farms, yet we do have a really growing trend of millennials and even those that are in older age groups that are looking to do something like this. In your wisdom as a community motivator, as a community organizer, what would you say to them about how to approach farmers in a way that starts to establish some credibility and some community conversations around developing land and property in a way that creates a win-win with these two, not opposing, they could easily be in reciprocity, interests? What would you recommend for them?
So your question is, with the average age of farmers being like high 50s, early 60s, and a lot of people having land but not a farmer to farm it?
I'm talking about the disparity between the farmer that has the land that they can't develop any longer, and are looking at the real, the
Hmm.
realization of having to sell it and dealing with whatever the tax implications are because they don't have inheritors. And then this growing surge of particularly the millennials, we have woofing now. You can go and work on someone else's property and find a website that can land you anywhere on the planet, as long as they are, pre-vetted farms, whether they be in Hawaii or the south of France. We do have a hunger in this generation. And I said, even those that are hitting retirement age, to be part of community creation at this level and to downsize or to get into their first homes that are small or live in yurts and get to know the land and create that relationship again. How do we get these retiring farmers and these aspiring millennials and really, again, hopefuls in our generation to get into communication with each other so they can create something in reciprocity? Do you have suggestions on that?
Yeah, so there are a number of programs that try to link retiring farmers with new aspiring and developing farmers. So that's one thing that is happening. I mean, some of the challenges are um, a lot of times if you've been farming all your life, and maybe if you inherited the land, your land is pretty valuable. So it's difficult for a young farmer to not only buy the land, but if you have infrastructure there, like barns, tractors, equipment, house, um, it becomes too much for a young person to be able to come up with the funds for or create them just through farming. So that's a real detriment to that happening. Now, I will say there is a surge of small farms in the United States. So we have the large farms that trend towards bigger and bigger, and then also a trend of smaller trend of new smaller farms, mainly for local markets, happening. So in this area, for example, we're in the Triangle, North Carolina. There are a lot of small farms that are able to sell directly, either directly to the consumer or to local markets that are willing to pay, a premium price for local, sustainably grown produce or food. So in counties that are close to those markets, there is the opportunity that small farmers can produce a decent income off a small amount of acreage, and that's more doable. So,
where is this website or resource that you just mentioned where these aspiring young would-be farmers or serfs or woofers can connect with landowners that have been, running farms but are getting close to retirement? Is there an actual resource that you can direct our viewership to?
So there are a number of land link websites. I wasn't prepared to talk about that tonight, so I didn't bring any of them with me. But I can look
Just
some
tell
of
them how
them
to
up.
Google it, and we'll just feel like we did them an attaboy on getting them directed to at least entertain the dialogue.
So
of it.
sometimes something like Farmer to Farmer Land Link, or sometimes a lot of these are through conventional farm organizations as well. Like North Carolina Farm Bureau for a while was funding a program. I'm not sure if they still are, but trying to link up in North Carolina retiring farmers with new farmers. Many other states have a program of trying to do the same thing. So
it can be found online, is what you're trying to say, if people can Google. And the Living Well community is also listed in a particular website for nationwide, I think it is, intentional communities across the United States. Is that correct, Harvey?
Right. So the Intentional Communities website. So I think it's just ic.org, but you can Google Intentional Communities, and they have a list of intentional communities all over the United States, and they break them out by states, so you can see what's different places, and it's a fun place to just check out.
what are the key tenets that are the most important, the aspects that you absolutely would implement in a really well thought out intentional community? And let's start with the Living Well community. Besides having these various lots of sizes and a lot of flexibility when it comes to not only the size, but also the color and the shape and the materials used, what else is currently being offered to give it such a complete neighborhood and really the spirit of community type of property that you are developing now? What are the most important features?
All right. Well, first of all, let me do a disclaimer. There is no one way to do community well. And one of the fun things about looking at the Intentional Communities website and then also visiting different communities is to see that each has their own personality and does things a little differently. So it depends what you're looking for. Some are more communal, totally communal in nature. Some are more individual. And then there's just some things that are shared, and some are a combination of individual and then some shared amenities as well. So I would say a Living Well community, it's that last version, which is everybody has their own individual space, so their own lot, their own house. But then there are shared spaces as well. So the shared spaces are community park, community garden, trails, and there's 53 acres of conservation area on the whole project. The whole project's 124 acres, and that 53 acres is, it's in a conservation easement, and everyone has certain rights to it. And it basically buffers the river and the creek and provides conservation benefit through, especially through keeping that area vegetated, so for water quality and wildlife and recreational use.
Okay. So you've got a background in not only building tiny homes. There is an event I know that you have every year where you bring people in and you talk about the tenets of building tiny homes and the different materials. And that happened, this last fall, or was that in the summer, Harvey?
Yeah, so we've done it 3 years now. It's in September every year, or it has been. I think we did it in October one year. And we have a website you can see more about. It's called www.smallhouseconvergence.com. So that'll let you see what the program was this last year. We're maybe going to do it differently next year, but maybe break it up into a couple one-day events. So we're still figuring that out. Taking the feedback of what happened this year, how can we, make it even better next year?
And you're covering different types of elements of building the tiny home, like the variants of materials, being on a permanent footprint as opposed to maybe being on the back of a trailer. I mean, tell our listeners a little bit about what you cover during that convergence. Just a few items, since we have more that we want to learn from you tonight, Harvey.
Sure. So we had a number of hands-on demonstrations and activities. So building different kinds of, using different techniques and materials to build small houses. So one using basic standard 2x4 framing, one using natural building materials, one using compressed earth blocks, one using container homes, making homes out of shipping containers, one doing timber frame, one primitive shelters. So the hands-on was one unique thing about it. And then we had a lot of sessions on different topics, sometimes with a panel of speakers and sometimes with an individual speaker. So that would cover things like people sharing their experience who were actually living in small and tiny houses, other technical things that were related, like how to produce your own energy or grow your own food, or
it really does pull towards self-reliance, doesn't it, Harvey? The goal is to bring a really spatial view into all that can be accomplished when we build not only intentionally on whatever land we choose to occupy, but also put that much conscientiousness into the shape and the size and the materials involved in our home you're really incorporating everything in terms of a more thoughtful and conscious footprint.
Well, the tiny or small house is like one step, and then the next step is what else can you integrate into that? So can we, when you have a smaller footprint, you have the opportunity to add on other things that maybe are easier than if you have a larger house. For example, it's easier to produce your own energy if you're using less energy. So you can add a solar array or some other form. It's easier to handle your waste because you're generally producing less waste. You're typically living outside more if you're in a small house than you would if you're in a larger house, because your outside becomes part of your required living space in a more fundamental way, because you need that space typically. So that also makes you open to growing more food possibly, or interacting more with your outside space, making that transition from outdoor to indoor more significant. So you might go from, like, you might have a patio outside, and then you might have a trellis that you go through to get into your door. So you just integrate the outdoor and indoor space typically more, because your outdoor space becomes multi-functional space,
Right.
as well.
Right. And we have such a big draw towards being outdoors now. I mean, just about every medical and mental health professional in the West is talking about the fact that human stress is so effectively mitigated when we just take a walk, when we get outside and get in nature, when we get our feet barefoot on the grass, or we let that cool fall brisk breeze, hit our faces, and we start breathing differently. We literally, habituate to being outdoors. So we know being in a community that is not only conscientious and thoughtful and more intentional, but also provides for these natural spaces that you've mentioned that the Living Well community did is key in being able to create the most beneficial environment. I am aware that you are kind of a master permaculturist, and that you also know the land well enough as a community developer to do foraging or wild herb types of walks and tours. We have just a few minutes left. Could you talk to our viewers a little bit about what it really takes to understand the land, and how you have sought to make those that would be interested in your community or learning about it become more conscientious about what the land offers?
Well, my wife and I, we've been farming for a lot of years, and right now we're even more passionate about not just what we can grow in the garden, but also what kind of grows itself, or we can encourage. Native Americans interacted with the land pretty aggressively too. So people have been doing this for centuries on this land. So their interventions were more in the way of some pruning, fire.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that they directly planted things, but they would certainly encourage certain things over other things that were more useful to them. And then, of course, some people even think they sort of hurted some of the wildlife in certain ways. So not really domesticated, but certainly had some control over what happened with some of the wildlife as well. So I get pretty excited about all that kind of stuff. Like, I love foraging for wild food, encouraging wild food. Like right now, so my wife, last night we had family over, this weekend, and so she cooked nettles, which are doing great right now. We have a big patch of nettle. So it basically can produce all year round. It's not a vegetable most people eat because they're not familiar with it, but it's perennial, very nutritious, extremely nutritious.
A little tricky to cultivate, but once you do that and know how to prepare it, it's actually got a lot of hidden nutrients that the public isn't typically aware of, right, Harvey?
So that's like no work vegetable.
Right.
You have to adjust your eating a little bit, get used to different foods. Like I do a lot of wild foraging for, like at Living Well, there's a lot of edible mushrooms, wild edible mushrooms. So oyster mushrooms, puffballs, other things. So not everyone wants to eat them because people have this fear of like, oh, what if that's really a poisonous mushroom? But they're there. If you don't have to know all the mushrooms, you just have to be certain that you're sure what this is. And oysters are a great example because oyster mushrooms are really easy to identify. They grow on logs. They don't grow on like dead logs or dying logs. They don't grow like out of the ground. They have the gills go all the way down the stems, so they're not just on the underside of the cap. Mm-hmm. They actually smell a little bit like an oyster, etc. So they have, and there's nothing else that looks like them. But if you're not sure, if like you have, and they always grow in a cluster, like they don't grow one at a time. Okay. So they're pretty easy to learn how to identify, and they're delicious. So
so we don't want to miss the edibles that are on the property, right? We really do want to not only have a symbiotic relationship that's respectful of the land, we also want to know what it's providing us so that we can be in that reciprocity, right, Harvey?
Right, and even with mushrooms, you can do things to encourage them beyond what they're naturally producing. Mm-hmm. Like you can introduce certain kinds of mushrooms.
Is that called inoculation, Harvey?
Inoculation, or just bringing them, some of the mushrooms on there, letting them naturally release their spores. Like right now, like last winter, we did a little workshop on shiitake mushrooms, which aren't native, but they're easy to grow. And so we took sweet gums that we were going to cut anyway, and some oak trees that we were going to cut anyway, and inoculated them. So now, those that did that had shiitake mushrooms this fall. And shiitake mushrooms, although, like I said, not native, but easy to grow, are like a wonder food. They're like high in protein. They have a full set of amino acids. They're tumor. They help reduce the risk of tumor. They have a lot of other health benefits. They're super nutritious.
Mm. It just sounds very romantic, and I wish we actually had more time, but we're getting really close to the end of the hour. When you consider how much thoughtfulness and how much preparation went into the community that you've created and the level with which you're educating those through the educational programs in the community college that you've established them, and what a far reach that has, I am certain that it is passing along a wealth of curiosity and interest and even motivation for others to be innovators such as yourself. And kind of bringing all of these pieces together, if you could, in just 2 minutes or less, Harvey, if we had interested people that are listening tonight, that are watching and are saying, okay, what do I really need to be able to take my interest and my passion beyond tiny homes or a particular community, or I have land or I know someone who has land, what types of individuals would you have them seek out to create at least the foundation of a successful community? Because obviously everyone can't have you, Harvey. We know you know so much about not only building and developing the land, but also the type of structures and knowing how to read the energy of the land as well as what it has to offer. Kind of create a compilation of what skill sets we would need to get them launched in creating their own communities.
Well, what I would say most of all is start doing it. It's never going to be easy. It's going to be harder than you think it is. Tie into a really deep motivation because, like even growing your own food, it's a lot of work. I mean, that's why we like harvesting wild food because it's less work. But you really have to go deep to identify what's going to sustain you too during the challenging times. It's sort of like, you're going to have drought times too, just like the land has drought times. You're going to have deep, dark times of the soul where you're wondering, why am I doing this? Like it's 12 o'clock at night and the possums are raiding the chicken pen and you'd really like to just stay in bed, but you can't ignore that either. or it's time to put another log on the fire because it's 20 degrees out, and if you're going to keep the fire going all night, someone has to get up and stoke it at 12. So all I'm saying is there are parts that are really hard about it. I mean, it's also, we all have things we do well and things we don't do well. Living with other people, whether it's, our immediate family or whoever, we're going to have times when that's a lot of fun and times when that's not as much fun.
Right.
So we have to build in an understanding of why we do this that's deep enough to work through that. And also humility, to understand that parts of this we're not going to do well either, and we're all learning.
It's really an evolutionary skill building, isn't it, Harvey? It is important to know exactly where our strengths are so that we can cultivate those strengths and learn more, and then be able to bring in others that have their various talents and abilities. And we really want to encourage our viewers to know not only where to find communities like yours and to feel the motivation to do it, but also to be able to even consider visiting your community and checking in with you and getting involved in some of the coursework that you do. So give them real quick a couple of websites, because we'd like to return them to your resources and make sure that they can find you.
The Community College in Pittsburgh is a good resource. CC, Central Carolina Community College. We have a nonprofit called Living Well Earth Stewards, and we also offer courses. So there's a course this Saturday, one-day course in primitive skills. So that's fire, tool making, water, wild harvesting, shelter. There'll be another class the 16th of December on wood spoon making. We'll probably do another one in February on shiitake mushrooms. So that nonprofit has a website too, although we have to update it. But you can go to www.livingwellearthstewards.com and feel free. There's some contact information there. If it's not updated enough, get up with whoever is listed as the contact, and they'll get you up to speed. And then Living Well Community has a website, which we've already mentioned. It's www.thelivingwellcommunity.com.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, we really do encourage our viewers that have an itch that they can't scratch around downsizing, about getting involved in a community that is as conscientious as what Living Well aspires to do and to be, and many others that are burgeoning up here in the United States. We understand that we are in a challenging economy. These are transitional times. These are times where we have to kind of take a look at our life purpose and what is our footprint, and what are we actually really narrowing down to have lives that were well lived mean for us when all is said and done. It isn't all about acquisition. It isn't all about chasing the dollar signs. There are simpler and much more organic and less stressful ways to live. So we hope that you'll take a look at these opportunities. We'll have a lot more along this content. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and remember, together we are the solution.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.